Hey, I want to welcome everybody to the Sacramental Charismatic. My name is Luke Geraty. I'm a pastor theologian living in Northern California. And today we are going to be having a conversation that's essentially going to continue addressing a topic that I've done several podcasts on in relation to a biblical, theological, and pastoral critique of Alan Scott's ministry, leadership, spiritual abuse. And today I'm really honored to have a guest named Bradley Andrews. Bradley, it is good to see you.
Hey, Luke. It's good to be here. I feel like this conversation in a lot of ways has been a long time coming. And so, before when all the Dwelling Place stuff kind of first hit the public airwaves and all that, I had people sending me your tweets. I wasn't on Twitter or anything at the time. And so you've been a champion for a long time. You've been the cause and the source of a lot of laughter, and I appreciate you. And I know a lot of others do, and I'm excited to chat today.
If there's anything I can provide, it is humor. That's about it. But so, you're living in New York now, but you were in California. Could you just share for our listeners, viewers, just a bit about maybe your background and why this is going to be a helpful conversation due to your own personal experience?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, like you said, I'm tuning in from New York City. And so I work here, go to school. I'm getting my MBA from NYU Stern. Me and my wife moved here just a little over a year ago. But before this, Cynthia is her name. Her and I, we were born and raised in Southern California, grew up in the Inland Empire. And around 2018, we got engaged, moved over to Orange County, where Vineyard Anaheim was, and began attending the church just a couple months after Alan Scott. Immediately, we jumped in after Alan Scott took over, should I say. And then immediately we jumped in, did the whole bit, entire head to immersion. So we were volunteering. We did their little school of ministry. And eventually Cynthia became the research assistant for Alan, did that as a volunteer capacity for a while. She jumped on staff. In 2021, I jumped on staff. And we were both there employed until 2022 when we both resigned, left, and then moved to New York City.
Okay. Yeah. So you were a part of the church for about 4 years in a leadership role on staff, heavily involved in the church's ministry there. I guess maybe to just bring any of our listeners up to speed. I know there's going to be people listening who maybe haven't followed all the controversy, but I'm just going to maybe bring everybody up to speed on my observations. You can weigh in with actual facts from the ground. But Alan Scott was a vineyard pastor in Northern Ireland. And I believe he also pastored in Scotland at one time. Is that correct? Yeah. So was that correct? Two vineyard churches, and then in 2000, prior to COVID, in 2000, I think around 17, 18, he moved to the U.S. And I think it was like the end of 2017, because the weekend that he was announced to be the new pastor, the former pastor of the Anaheim Vineyard, Lance Pitluck, was with me actually up here in Red Bluff when it all came out. And so I want to say that was like 2017 that it got announced. But so about a couple years ago, they led their church to disfellowship from the Vineyard and from Vineyard USA. And that's when a lot of controversy started coming out. There were numerous accusations that had come out that had actually kind of been covered up from previous leadership capacities that he had in both Scotland and in Northern Ireland. And there were patterns of bad theology would be one simple way to put it. But I think the most concerning thing was that there were numerous allegations of spiritual abuse. And this led to an independent investigation from the Vineyard movement in the UK, which was connected to the Vineyard Church that he pastored at. And so there's been a lot of controversy, a lot of accusations. As you noted, I've been, been pretty public about my opinions. Everybody knows that. But that's kind of the concerns that have been kind of being, I guess, fleshed out and discussed for the last 2 years. So there's been not just allegations, but there was an independent investigation that found that there was significant evidence of spiritual abuse. But you and your wife both experienced that firsthand as well. And that's kind of how we had connected at some point in time. So that's my broad overview. What would you add to it?
Yeah, no, that's right. So, to even give a little bit more context, my wife was on the pastoral team. So, if you will, the inner circle around Alan Scott back then it was Vineyard Anaheim. Now it's Dwelling Place Anaheim, which is what I'll probably refer to it often as, Dwelling Place or DPA. Myself, I was on the managerial staff there. So I oversaw all the operations for their compassion ministry and what other people call like benevolence or outreach. Mm-hmm. Our time there was, it was bizarro world. You know what I mean? It was just the most insane, difficult, challenging, damaging time of our life. My wife and I, when we first stepped foot into Vineyard Anaheim, we weren't even married yet. We were engaged. We were 22 years old. Cynthia just graduated university. We were looking for a new place, new life, a new community to kind of, build roots and build a life, and we're looking at trying to create community for the long term and find some place that we could get involved. And, for all the reasons I'm sure that we can discuss today, we were given this very much impression because of there's so many lovely people that were there, and that honestly, some that are still there. That rope you in, and the types of promises that were made, the types of affirmations that were given by outside sources, and the mythology that was being spun to really believe like this was a place, like God was moving, this place that we just stumbled into by accident and then discovered, and now how lucky we are we to be here. And really, it kicked off just for years, impossible treadmill of trying to keep up with one man's arbitrary mood swings, decisions, needs to keep his ego inflated at all times, and be the face of the movement of God that he was really fighting. Yeah, man, it was rough. It was terrible. We, like I said, we'll talk, I'm sure, a lot more about experiences. I can give a lot of concrete examples over our time here. But even after we left, we had left and we were confused and unbelievably emotional and damaged and not sure which way was up, which way was down. We just knew that we had to get out. We wanted to do it in a way that didn't completely destroy all these friends that we had created. So we just said, God's telling us to go somewhere else. We love you all. Goodbye. And within weeks, we started processing with people from the outside, everything that I experienced, the confusion around the dissociation. Quite honestly, the lies that were being told, the things that we were seeing said from the pulpit, directly contradicting what we were being told in private, in staff meetings or emails and communications. And it wasn't until someone that we really loved and trusted for the first time said, hey, I think what you guys are describing is spiritual abuse. And something, honestly, about hearing that word from someone else, I felt brought everything into focus. So we sat, we processed, we worked out how to try to heal. We had told some friends of ours that are pastors at the church not to tell anyone, but we think this is what we're experiencing. We think this is what you're experiencing. They turned around and told HR and told Alan, and then put us in contact with a lawyer. And then after a few months, we recognized that this was not just our story, but the experience of a lot of other people stretching back through Alan's history. Was something that had been going on for a long time that other people felt were too afraid to talk about. And so it was actually my wife and I that initially were the first ones that decided to go and approach Roy's to talk about what we'd experienced and have an actual reporter, examine our stories, find corroborating evidence. And they were the first ones to publish the story of over a dozen victims at Vineyard Anaheim themselves who had suffered or experienced spiritual abuse.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to ask you a few questions. So I do want to just say, we're going to get into, because I think there's a number of things that we're going to do. Because on one hand, there's a biblical theological framework that has, been concerning to me about Alan Scott's leadership for at least 15 years, when I first kind of stumbled upon him. I've just seen consistently this theological framework that I've always been like, that's not Vineyard. That's not who we are. That's not influenced by, the values of John Wimber and whatnot. So that's always been a little frustrating, that we haven't had a space to really address that until now. But the other side of it is the spiritual abuse accusations, because there's people who hold different theology than I do that don't spiritually abuse people, though. So there's a connection there for sure. I do think that there's a theological connection that tends to lead towards some harmful practices. But I want to be clear that that's not something that everybody who holds to some more, I guess, hyper Pentecostal or, fivefold apostolic Christianity. Although what we're seeing, I think, with IHOP and with other things that are happening around the church, there's accusations about Bethel. We saw Hillsong. We now have Dwelling Place Anaheim. There seems to be there is enough for us to be able to say, hey, maybe there is a connection. But what I'd love to know a bit more about is you talked about these investigations and then your participation in it. Because what I have seen on Twitter is some people have said, well, you guys didn't participate in the investigation and you had an opportunity to bring it to the church because people are using Matthew 18 out of context abusively, in my opinion. But they say, you didn't follow this protocol. What is the primary reason that you mentioned it a little bit, but what was the primary reason why you didn't go through the investigation? Okay, scare quotes, the investigation that was suggested to you. Could you give us a little bit of reasoning behind that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I love that you brought up the whole Matthew 18 thing as well. That they love that. All these guys do. And that actually does tie directly into this, right? So yeah, to tell the story exactly, like I said, we had just left staff, and we had done it in what at the time we thought was like the honoring, best possible way to do it. Mm-hmm. We couldn't afford to stay anymore, emotionally, psychologically. Yeah. We had been postponing it for so long until literally just just broke down. It's like, we cannot do this. And we don't have jobs lined up. We don't know where else we'd go. We just need to leave. And so we did. And so when I mentioned we had told some of our friends who were pastors on staff, we sat down, and what had really happened was these are people that we've done life with now for the last 4 years. They're at our wedding. They lived in the same apartment complex with us during COVID, and they're our COVID buddies. We shared bread countless times. We knew their kids. These are real friendships. These aren't like abstract concepts. These are real people who know us and we love. We said this time, we said, we don't really know what's going on with ourselves, what we came out of. But we are going to make one rule. This is just Cynthia and I talking to each other. I was like, we are just not going to lie anymore. We're just not going to say anything or go along or agree with anything that we just don't feel is true. And if it bothers us or it's rubbing us, it's like not our impression of things. Like, we're just going to say something, which felt like a real big kind of like reclaiming of our agency at that point. And we sat down at this table with them, and they began to apologize to us, like, hey, specifically Cynthia, since she was a lot closer to Alan's direct leadership than I was. I was in just a different area department. They said, like, we know, like, you and Alan kind of had some rough times. And that's where we were like, it wasn't just rough times. Like, this is awful. That we know it's awful for them. When people are breaking down, when they're crying after meetings, when they're going through deep emotional distress, as all of them and many of us were, it's like we talk about this with each other. We commiserate with one another. It's like, we know what you're going through. Anyways, to get through this, when they put us in touch with a lawyer after we had told them this, that lawyer, they basically had given us a lot of legalese about how, like, we take these types of allegations very seriously. We want to investigate them. We had said no. And we later on just reconsidered, like, hey, maybe we should do this, because we really feel very, very confidently that if there are any investigations that are done, then they are going to come up with the truth. That Alan is a egomaniacal leader who abuses the people that are beneath him. And he sets up systems and structures in such a way that are meant to exploit and take advantage of people. We thought maybe we should at least give this thing a shot. So we emailed them and we asked them like questions. This is all public and online. You know, you can find copies of it. This is what we said. We said, look, we just want to we want to know what exactly you were hired to do. What's your scope of work? What is the final form going to look like? How it's going to be presented? What type of, info is going to be detailed out about the end of this? What type of education understanding do you have in like psychological abuse, emotional abuse, spiritual abuse? Do you even understand Christianity, and like religion and how these dynamics work? And then the last thing, which was like the biggest concern for us, is that we looked up who this person was. And this is a individual doing the investigation, is a lawyer from the exact same law firm that is also representing Alan Scott, his wife, Catherine, Jeremy Riddle, who was a board member, Jeremy Riddle's wife, Katie Riddle, and all the other board members for a lawsuit involving over $63 million in assets.
Yeah.
And so we're making this association. It's like, well, if you're a lawyer that works in the same firm as, that are trying to essentially make sure that these people don't lose possession of millions and millions of dollars, how do we know that there isn't some conflict of interest? And quite frankly, her answer back, again, it's all public. She didn't give answers to most, if any, of my questions. And she basically just said, like, I represent there's no conflict of interest. And we found that deeply, deeply unsatisfactory.
Yeah. I mean, I remember when that was all happening, it was almost, it was hard to take serious a person who has a law degree who doesn't understand how that's clearly a conflict of interest, and no victim in the world would agree to that. In fact, that's kind of where we see with the IHOP debacle. I mean, it's insane to me that there still is not a third party investigation that has happened, even though not only has every victim requested a third party investigation, but there are literally countless numbers of leaders all over the body of Christ who have said you need to have an actual third party investigation that doesn't include people who are working for you to do it. So I can't even. I mean, it's hard to take serious.
No. I mean, no, and you shouldn't take it serious. And I'm glad that the people at IHOP didn't, the victims from IHOP didn't take it serious. No one should be willing to do that or choose to do that. And the unfortunate side, like you said, is that this gets spun by places like Dwelling Place, like IHOP. Is like, well, no one wants to come and do an investigation because Dwelling Place said, like, we investigated like 10 to 13 people. And the question on my end is like, well, who did you investigate? None of the victims and people with solid concrete issues that I know. And if you're going to turn around and tell me, you investigated 10 to 13 people and you asked Alan questions, you asked his wife questions.
Yeah.
It's like that.
And it's crazy because at the end of that investigation, they always are found innocent. It's amazing how they always are innocent of those investigations. But I think it's important to point out, as you noted, I personally know at least 8 or 9 victims who have reached out and have said that they would be willing to participate in that investigation, again quotes, and who were never contacted by anyone from Anaheim. So it's also quite a bit of gaslighting on their part, just based off of what I've heard from the victims.
Yeah, well, I mean, also to go back, part of the quote unquote insult, when they said, like, we take allegations like this very seriously, that email from our HR. And this goes back to your little Matthew 18 thing. 2 things on this. I'll get to the story in a second. But the Matthew 18 thing is always a very ironic sidestep, right? Because people in these positions of authority and power in churches say that, your story has no merit because you didn't choose to kind of submit it to me through the right channels. Which is just really like the most insane hypocrisy, and legalistic approach that could possibly be there. It's like your entire story has no merit because you didn't submit it the correct way. I think that's very silly. But number 2 on that, it's like you guys are completely missing the point. As much as people try and use that as like, this is the word of God, you can't subvert it. I agree. This is wonderful wisdom on how to go about interpersonal, issues. It's not meant to apply to situations of abuse. And even if it did, I love to point people personally, getting the theology side of things, to Matthew chapter 5, where Jesus actually flips that process. And he says, if you are going to worship at the temple and you're at the altar and you find out or remember that your brethren has something against you, you need to drop your sacrifice and go make up with them right away. And in that case, he places the burden right on these other people, not
absolutely.
the person who's offended.
I mean,
the offendee.
We would never, ever tell the victim of rape to go confront their rapist in a one-on-one meeting before going public. I mean, it's absolutely insane.
No, it's bonkers. It's so bonkers.
Yeah. Also, too, I think with that, with the Matthew 18 thing, it's always been too, okay, Jesus gives a very broad explanation about confronting conflict, but again, I think it's different in that context as well as from the abuse we're talking about. But so, moreover, though, you have an example here where they were not actually doing Matthew 18 really on their end too as well.
Yeah. Well, what I would say is that we did talk to them. Well, the insult in them saying like we take allegations very seriously is that they were only reaching out to us because now they were concerned that there'd be legal ramifications, we're outside of their power, and they kind of the public perception slipping up a little bit. Cynthia and I both had numerous conversations with so many people on staff. We had conversations with HR. We had conversations with Alan himself about our issues. And when we had these types of conversations with them, they were never concerned. They never did anything except kind of diminish and backpedal and do a lot of the same stuff that you're seeing them do in public, My wife, for instance, she went to our HR, Greg Shear, who's also a board member, one of three that are still remaining. So he makes up 33% apparently the decision-making power at nowadays at Dwelling Place. She went to him and said hey, I have serious concerns. And she told him flat out, I'm afraid of Alan Scott. And his response was, I'm afraid of him too. And he began to tell the story he really is he's quite frightening. He can be scary and very harsh, and he told this story about how essentially he had once tried to essentially change his job description a little bit. He's unpaid staff, and so he went up and said, Alan, I don't really want to do this one function anymore. And Alan got irked with it and started throwing him a goodbye party. And he came back and was like, oh, no. It's what are you doing? He's like, well, you said you didn't want to do this. So I thought you just said you didn't want to be here anymore. And so again, he decided to go on doing that function. But when Cynthia's in these types of meetings and trying to explain, I'm scared of him. This is HR. This is supposed to be the proper function. This is the ways I'm supposed to go about these things. Saying I'm having problems, having issues, the officially sanctioned ways. And you have the board member saying I'm scared of him too. Where do you go there? What else are you supposed to do? And there's not going to be any record of that conversation. Greg calls them all hallway conversations they weren't serious. I had conversations with Greg. We had conversations with Alan himself. We sat down, both of us together, and Cynthia tried to address some of these problems. She said, hey, I really feel I don't know where I stand with you. Your mood can flip like this. And one day I think I'm really good with you, and the next day I'm feeling really iced out, And he flipped it on her in the moment. It's I just so surprised to even hear you say that. I can't imagine why you'd say that. I spend more time with you than anybody else besides James Renwick on the staff and yada, yada, and she just begins to shrink back. And I wasn't, it's,
and again,
you see where I'm going.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say, I think for anyone because there are still, shockingly, there's some people who are still a part of the community or who are still either justifying or defending these things. But when you have, I've spoken to people going all the way back to Ireland and Scotland who have the same exact story, And so if there's a, it seems a bit ridiculous to suggest that these dozens of people are all lying. It could be. It could be, but considering that well, actually, I with an independent investigation that happened in the UK, it's hard to see that now because it's right. They did that. They actually had a non-vineyard. It was not a group of people who were connected to the vineyard. They weren't vineyard people. It was a true independent investigation. So there's a pattern here that seems to be problematic, and the experience that you Cynthia and countless other people have had, I want to say is why I think it's important for us to have a bit more conversation about the biblical, theological, and pastoral or practical problems here too. And so for anybody listening, I guess that's kind of why we're doing this. I have said after every single podcast that I've done on Alan, I'm like, that was the last one. Then more comes out and it's like, oh my gosh. Okay, we need to talk about that too. So let's talk a little bit about, if you're cool with this, I'd love to talk a little bit about some of the biblical theology at work here. Because from day one, I mean, I remember, I think I actually, my first interaction with Alan Scott was listening to some teaching that somebody had sent me. And then I saw, on Twitter from time to time tweets that I just was like, oh my gosh, that is a horrendous take. So let's start with pneumatology, because I think Alan, pneumatology being the study of the Holy Spirit, he likes to be a champion for the work and the power of the Spirit. If you watch any of his sermons or any of their worship, there's always this really strong emphasis on the in-breaking presence and power of the Spirit. But it seems like there's such a it's almost like his theology of the Spirit is so one-dimensional, and it doesn't really have this full, broad appreciation of all that Scripture says about the Spirit. Because I kind of want to know, like, would it be okay to be an introvert in that church community, or does the Holy Spirit not ever work in introverts' lives who are not going to run around and do backflips? Is that not allowed? What would you say about that?
Yeah, I would say that introverts, at least in the way that you're describing them, have a very difficult and tortured time there.
Okay.
And like I said, I described it. Tortured. I described it. Yeah. Oh, it's a terrible experience then. I mean, even for extrovert, So yeah, exactly. So Alan prides himself on every environment being supernatural, and that's the language that we'd use. Like, not to say that he never talks about the Holy Spirit, because he does, but I would actually say, like, the way it's framed and leaned into the most is the language of, like, the supernatural. Every environment, everything needs to include the supernatural, right? Like, you're not allowed to, you have to constantly producing stories of the supernatural where people, you or people around you, are having encounters with God. And so when you see one-dimensional, it's very one-dimensional. It's very flat, because all of the theology, all the teachings, all the environments, everything's geared towards getting people to have a supernatural experience. And that's the reason it feels flat, because it's not meant to be robust. We walked out of the room without, some type of shaking, quivering, healing, word of knowledge, prophetic something being given. Then it was a definitive disgrace of failure. I could tell you, as the pastoral staff, if you walked out of an environment without a story like that, I mean, you were done. Alan would ice you for like a week, wouldn't talk to you, would find some way of making sure you knew that the favor of God was not on your life, because that's a direct one-to-one in his mind. And so just to go along with what you're saying, introverts will have a terrible time, because one, in order to receive any type of like recognition, a favor of God being on your life, of being seen as a mature, credible, Jesus-loving individual in that church, you need to be experiencing or catalyzing supernatural events. And that means you need either be out in the streets, witnessing, talking to people, talking to strangers. You need to be, exactly experiencing something in there. And the level of scrutiny that I'm talking about with that is so tight, Luke. I mean, the way that he does this, engages this, I mean, he would even tell us, at one point he says, when guest teachers come into the church, I watch who they're ministering to, and I know by how long that guest teacher is praying for someone, the level of spiritual activity in that person's life. And that can sound like a very like benign sort of, like, it can sound just like bad theology. Like, you just toss that out. That's kind of silly, kind of stupid. But in this type of environment where everything is amped up to just like meteoric, just like incredible heights of like God is supposed to be moving, everything is symbolic, everything's supernatural, God is in everything or do something. If you're like as a member of your, the school of ministry or on staff, and that guest preacher now passes you up or only prays for you for 2 seconds, dude, you're done. God's not really on your life. You're not really doing something. You're not going to get tagged with time to pray or to prophesy or to be involved.
Are you saying that if the guest speaker doesn't pray for a long time, they're not as anointed, or if you don't receive prayer for very long, you're not anointed?
Yeah. Sorry if I didn't communicate. So the amount of time that you got prayed for was indicative to Alan of how much favor was on your life.
Oh, wow. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah. So if Randy Clark comes and you get, like a 30-second prayer compared to the guy who got like 5, that 30-second guy is like, he's going to be a leader next week, or something.
That's very similar to, I don't know if you have watched that Matt Redman documentary on Mike Pivolacci, but that is a reoccurring theme in that documentary about how people who were no longer, they basically would feel ostracized and discarded simply because they didn't know why. They would just always be, feeling like, I don't know, is he mad at me? And a lot of these people were very young, very impressionable. And that was and so that was a form of spiritual abuse, in that it was causing people to have, identity crises, and they're young. Yeah. And so I could see how that'd be, a major problem for anybody being in that environment, man. I think you talk about a robust theology. I'm so happy that you said that word, by the way. It's like, oh yeah, robust pneumatology. Yes. I'm curious, how often does the Dwelling Place celebrate communion, the Eucharist?
Oh, goodness. I mean, at most, maybe once a quarter, probably less.
Yeah. Interesting.
So I mean, 3-4 times a year, maybe.
Okay. Well, that's bait. You're just giving me bait. I'm going to move on from that one. But I think it's important because I believe in the supernatural. I have no problem, believing for, seeing, expecting miraculous, supernatural, spiritual gift things like healing or hearing prophetic words. But it seems to me like extremely problematic when you have a theology that demands results, in the sense of because then what it is it's no longer allowing for a spontaneous work of the Spirit. It now becomes, we have to produce these XYZ markers in order to be deemed worthy, or to be deemed anointed, or to be deemed, really experiencing the kingdom. And that is, that right there, just for anyone listening, I think that is a spiritually abusive theology, and pastoral leadership too, because again, I always use the introvert as the example, but introverts are created in the image of God and bear the image of God. And, there's 21 to 22 different spiritual gifts listed in the New Testament. And not all of them are radical supernatural gifts. You have the gift of helps or administration, for example, that, I think a lot of introverts tend to love those spiritual gifts because they're allowed to function in the way that God has gifted them, while also being able to pray for people and to share prophetic words, but without all the hype. And that's what I'm hearing from you, is that there was this pneumatology, a theology of the Spirit that was just very much a lot of hype, and it was expectations of hype and supernatural expectations of, these crazy things happening. Otherwise, you are not marked by God, and that seems pretty problematic.
Yeah, what I'd say is this comes directly from Bethel, right, and from Bill Johnson, and I don't mean that just trying to have Bethel catch a stray. I mean that in the sense of Alan literally did get this theology. They disseminated books to us as School of Ministry students from them, on the subject, and I think their theological argument, which will be fun maybe just to tease out a little bit, is very simple, right? It's like Jesus said that I only do what I saw the Father doing. And Jesus, everywhere he went, was supernatural, and the miracles that he stepped in. But God, we know also from the Bible, is always doing something. He's always at work. And so you need to walk into a room with the eyes to see what it is that God is doing and be able to step into that at any moment, right? So the kind of the catchphrase that Alan would use often would be that we follow, I'll probably misquote it now, we'll follow the favor, find the favor, and then we narrow the focus. So you want to go in, you want to find where God's at, and then you want to just really hone in on it. And again, that meant specifically in these supernatural environments. And so what it was, like you're saying, is you're going in, and the need to justify yourself as an individual who's in tune with the Spirit of God and connected to him in actual intimacy was what the fruit of that is, that you're able to step into what God is doing, that you're showing that and you're releasing it everywhere. And what that does, right, is it hijacks people's genuine concern, like want to be partnered with God, to want to be close to him and love him. And obviously see the gospel and the kingdom advanced. I think it's performance based. And I think the, like when you zoom out a little bit, what it is that it's all, like you said, you use the word hype, and that hype is right, but it's also not right. It is hype. I think it's correct. It didn't feel like hype when we were in the middle of it, right? What it felt like was that we are pushing, we are working, and we are, how do I say this? We are pressing into God for revival.
Yes.
And that concept, I think, of revival is the big one.
Yeah, because I'm contrasting again. So you had shared earlier when we were talking about, so you don't have a vineyard background as much, correct? Like you didn't grow up in the vineyard, or No. So I'm going to come in and be the vineyard voice for a moment here, okay, just for anyone listening. And I've been hugely influenced by John Wimber. I think John Wimber, the sanity of John Wimber would literally save most of the Pentecostal charismatic craziness if we would just go read his stuff again. But it's interesting how in the apostolic fivefold NAR supernatural world, there's a theological framework there that is very, very interesting, because it is very much a human effort, human responsibility to essentially like earn. And we basically see, if I do this, God will then do that. If I pray this way, or if I go out and do these things, God is required to show up and show off. And, if we want to have supernatural ministry, then we need to X, Y, Z. And it's interesting because I think another perspective throughout church history on, if you're studying renewals or revivals, is my observation is that generally God showed up for people who were totally not ready and had no idea what they were doing. Where there wasn't there's one revival that oftentimes gets, which would be interesting, because I think the Welsh revival, there's a number of stories about how people had been praying for decades before it would happen, and then it happened. But for the most part, we see examples of that not being the case. So that theological framework is very interesting, because it's so different within my lowercase c charismatic, maybe perhaps, or vineyard influenced, Wimber influenced thinking, where it's like, because that whole idea of seeing what the Father is doing that's a John Wimberism. This idea of seeing what the Father is doing based off of the Gospel of John and John 5, and then partnering with God and joining him in his work. But I've always found it interesting that the folks who had that or heard that and then kind of built on it have now, it's like God is only doing supernatural, miraculous things, and it's never ever something normal or mundane. Does God not care about those things? Does he hate those things?
Yeah, I think one of my contentions with revival culture in general is that people is just the mistake of thinking that just because you're not seeing activity or motion of any type, of making the assumption that God's not at work. And that's just not true. God is just as much at work and active and alive during the times of silence and quiet and inactivity, as he is during the great outpourings and manifestations and signs. What I think Wimber calls like the ebbs, the flows, and the high tides. You know what I mean? Or the ebb, the low ebbs and high tides. He's just as active. He's just at work. And in my opinion, like the stepping in, like we all, in this mindset and mind frame, like I understand that people's intentions are honest about wanting to bring heaven to earth, about seeing the kingdom of God manifest, but like this idea that like my job is to go into a room and like unveil the glory of God to be shown for all, I think is backwards. Like God is everywhere all the time. He's in everything. That's what it means when it says he's always working. And you go back, you throw back the curtain all the time. It's like, don't do that. Like God has hidden himself because he's meek and because he's humble. That's the wonder and the mystery of God.
Mm-hmm.
Don't rob him of his meekness. If anything, what you're supposed to do is embody it. You're supposed to imitate it and emulate it. And this attitude of going in is doing the opposite. It's working on the opposite force. It's let me make a spectacle. Let me make a display. Let's do something grand and big. And, that justifies the activity and the work. And that's what's wrong, in my opinion, with revival culture in general. The reason I think that a lot of these people that are very big advocates for like revival and for seeing God come it is a lot with their theology, but because that mindset that one day God is going to show up and just kind of correct everything, a whole city, a whole region, a whole nation, and it's dependent upon how I partner with him in this moment and making something happen. It makes people feel like the ends justify the means. That I can mistreat people, that I can abuse them, that I can say whatever I want to say to them, I can do whatever I want to do with them, because at the end of the day, I'm working towards the greater good. I'm working towards heaven on earth, this utopian idea that never comes, and it justifies unethical, immoral, bad behavior.
Yeah. It seems to also be exhausting. That's what having been around. I've spent some time. When the Pensacola revival was going on down in Brownsville, Toronto. I've been to both those locations. I've been around revival culture before, and besides having some different theological questions I'd want to ask, it always just seemed very exhausting. Like, man, but you're talking about this, and culture is a good word, I think, to use in regard to this revival supernatural culture. But it's interesting how one-dimensional the pneumatology is. The doctrine of the Holy Spirit is so one-dimensional. And I just wonder sometimes, and I've been saying for a long time, I just think we need better theology in the charismatic tradition in general, because if your only tool is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. And so if your only tool is supernatural breakthrough, then everything is going to require supernatural breakthrough. And I just think that it overlooks a lot of different beautiful things about the kingdom of God that we need, that will help us in those ebbs and flows, like you're saying. Like, when things aren't popping off, and maybe you're going through some trials and tribulations, or there's grief that's happening, or someone just passed away in your church community. Is it okay to grieve? Can the Spirit be present in the not yet of the kingdom, or do we really have such bad theology that we only think that the Spirit is present in the now? And that's obviously one of the differences, I think, about the Vineyard's theology of the kingdom and Bethel's theology of the kingdom. I want to be very clear. I think that I have some questions and concerns about Bethel's theology, but I want to differentiate between what they, the abuse that Alan Scott has carried out. I have never, ever heard things like that about Bill Johnson. So even though I have some major differences of opinion on some of his theology, I don't want to accuse them of this. But one of the things that I've noticed is that there is a different theology of the kingdom at work in their framework, because amongst the Word of Faith group, you probably are familiar with the Word of Faith. Healing is, for everybody. If you haven't been healed, it's because you're either in sin or you don't have enough faith. Even though Bethel has historically borrowed a lot of that language, it's interesting. Their framework is different, because in the Word of Faith tradition, they build that whole entire theology on an over-realized atonement theology. Like, they always appeal to, like, Christ died for your sin, by his stripes we are healed, the text in Matthew and Peter. But in the Bethel world, it's an over-realized kingdom theology where there's a strong emphasis on the now, and there's, I think, less emphasis on the not yet. Whereas I do think that it is a good critique that there are some churches out there, like in the Vineyard, who have a little bit maybe too much not yet, and maybe they've lost an emphasis on the now. I think that could be an accurate. What was your impression about, like, when you hear about the kingdom or heard about the kingdom in those circles? Was there any acknowledgement of the not yet of the kingdom, or that tension between living in the inbreaking of the kingdom and the not yet consummated of the kingdom?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, first of all, I think it's important just to say, the unit or the community at Dwelling Place Anaheim. It's, in my mind, I still think of in a lot of ways like very concentric circles, like the stories that are told, the priorities, and honestly the stress and exposure, right, that you have like to Alan makes for a very different group than the people who are like, you take a step back and that's like just general stuff. You take a step back and like volunteers and people really involved. And you take a step back and it's just like the people who are attending. Like if you're just attending, honestly, what you're experiencing is that other layer of people, which is just genuinely wonderful, loving, incredible people. What I would say too is when I first came, a lot of the stuff I think about Dwelling Place Anaheim, which was still Vineyard Anaheim, that drew me and Cynthia in. Later on, I think I kind of just figured out like all the things I really loved about this place that seemed really remarkable, or most of them, beyond the people themselves, were Vineyard, values and Vineyard traits that either got deteriorated, chucked away, or thrown or warped eventually. And then all that to say, there's also a lot of Vineyard people who I think have a lot of the right answers, not recognizing that that's the type of things that they were saying was stuff Alan wouldn't like. Anyways, so to answer your question, though,
I've heard that. No, that was not the right answer. Yeah. That was the answer in the previous administration.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, like they intentionally set us out to get rid of what they called the old stories, anything that resembled like the old Vineyard. We're supposed to like throw out and delete and stuff. Anyways, what I was going to say about the kingdom theology aspect of it. I don't know if it's always. I don't think it was very grounded all the time, like in theology, Luke. I don't think like it necessarily was. Like people, I don't think in general are looking for like let me like search deep into the scriptures to find out how to handle these tensions. I think most of it is acting out of like, you had a lot of people that would come, maybe myself included, right? That would like come and would want, I just know that like, I really love people. I really know that like, it sucks being sick. I know it really sucks when other people are sick. And I'm just being encouraged by the people in the front to pray for everybody that I see, to go after everything that I see. And if I let into my head too much the possibility that it might not happen, then maybe I won't have the faith to, or the courage to do this at all. And again,
that's not all wrong too. I mean, that's the challenge, I think, in this tension. And that's part of the tension is that, it's not that, that answer of lack of faith. I mean, Wimber famously said faith is spelled R-I-S-K, right? And it just seems like, I don't know. I found Wimber really helpful for me when I was kind of trying to, I went through this like kind of a backup, like I went through this phase where I had been attending a church that was pretty Pentecostally and very apostolic prophetic stuff. And I had, I was in an internship and saw all this spiritual abuse happening. We didn't have a grid for that because I was in the 90s. Apparently there wasn't a thing, but it was like happening and moral failures and all that stuff. And prophets and prophetesses were brought in to prophesy the things that they were told to prophesy. And I was pretty enamored with, I became enamored to the point of like, maybe there isn't any charismatic stuff. And I went down this like, I'm going to figure out what my views on the Holy Spirit and spiritual gifts are. And it was Wimber, rereading Wimber, who really saved me in some ways from going and becoming some cessationist. But I loved how Wimber would say, like when people would ask him, well, why aren't certain people healed? He was fine with saying, we don't know. And he was also okay with saying our job is just to keep praying. And like, I've always felt that like, okay, that's something I can do. I can't have all the answers as to why things are happening. And that's what's always frustrating to me about certain cultures where it's like, no, we have to have an answer and it has to be lack of faith or, sin or some crazy thing. So,
yeah, no, well, exactly. Because what you run into is just the truth is that not everybody is healed and not everybody is going to be healed. And people do get sick and they do get hurt and they do die. And it sucks and it's unfortunate and it's awful. But I would say, it's a lot of this stuff with Bethel and with this thing at Dwelling Place is that the leaders up there, number one, they encourage this. I mean, not all of them intentionally. I would say Anna, right? Like he intentions this. he intentionally encourages that activity to go out and pray. And you have to see this because it creates stories, and then they use those stories as a way of making themselves popular, seem like God is really on them,
marketing,
gain popularity, money. Exactly. But what I would say, is that at the time it feels to a lot of people, I'm sure it feels to a lot of people at Dwelling Place right now, it feels like a high view of the supernatural, right? It's like God can show up anywhere and do anything, that miracle can happen at any moment, and that all of everything that Christianity should do should be supernatural. It feels like that's a high view. And when I left, I just recognized, like, man, demanding or needing God to show up in a physical manifestation is not a high view of the supernatural, actually the low view. And it's refusing to see and accept all the incredibly wonderful supernatural elements of the Christian faith and the Christian tradition that is supernatural when you sit down and you break bread, like with people. You know what I mean? When diverse communities, when relationships are mended, when relationships are deepened, all the other facets, when you talked about the sacraments, you know what I mean? And the things that we do, there is presence of God in those things. And that by definition is what is supernatural, not the physical manifestations, not upholding all the things. And by limiting your definition and your scope and understanding of the experience and the presence of God to a feeling of him being in the room or him manifesting himself physically, it's a very, very demeaning view of the supernatural.
Yeah. And also too, man, it would really be a bummer to not be able to go on vacation ever, because if you do, you're going to miss the manifest presence of God. I would just find that as being super problematic.
That's actually a very real problem at Dwelling Place.
Yeah, I've observed, because it seems like a lot of people are on vacation lately. Sorry, being mean, but
Yeah, well, it leaks over into some wacko statements too, man. Like, again, I'm just gonna try and make the main thing here for me, But like, Alan just has the most unverified stuff he says. Most famously, like, he talks about stuff in the report, or like, I could hear the private conversations that are people happening in their room. I know people sin just by looking at them. Yeah. But I mean, like, he would just go after crazy things. I remember at one point at a pastoral meeting, he told my wife and the rest of the pastoral team, like none of you should be exercising or like into the gym or like working on your body. That is like, has such little profit and such little benefit. Like, I trust that the Lord will supernaturally invigorate me, that my energy and my strength comes from God. I know that he's going to sustain me. He's like, at one point, oh my God, this is so funny. He at one point said that the Lord's already told me I'm not going to get COVID. This is during COVID. And so what do you think happened, Luke?
Of course. I mean, like everybody.
He got COVID, but he did not admit it. He was sick. He was out. People were like, is it COVID? He was like, I'm not COVID. I remember people who would be more aware than me coming out of the room. Exactly. Yeah. That's exactly right. And it's like, dude, you just got COVID, but it's like the wacko, just cognitive dissonance, that's like a mild lie that I can point to.
What's interesting too about that, again, to bring this back, is there's a theological framework there in his I don't need to take care of my body theology, because I remember the first tweet that I ever read from him where I was like, that is the worst take of all time, was related to worship. And he set up this, it was totally a Platonic dualism, Gnostic nonsense, where it's like this, like there's the spiritual and the physical, and the spiritual's all that matters and the physical's not. And it was just like, oh my gosh, this is nuts, because in the second and third century, the church actually dealt with this. We actually said that's bad. Gnosticism is bad. I don't, and it just reoccurs in a lot of his stuff. Okay. Moving on to another biblical theological thing, which is connected to the pneumatology, but we already just kind of hinted at it. Ecclesiology, doctrine of the church, because I have some major concerns about what I have consistently heard and seen. No accountability. You mentioned, I mean, at one time when this, because backing up, when he disassociated from the Vineyard, he did that unilaterally on his own. He informed board members that he had done it. He informed the church that he had done it, and then had to back up because he got a lot of pushback from a lot of people who had been involved in that church for a very long time under John Wimber. So now, as you noted, I've heard no one actually knows who the board members are actually, other than the three, right? Because the Riddles are gone. Julianne, whatever, is gone. Oh, isn't Banning still? So there's four.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no. So the only
guy.
three. Yeah, so I'll run through the board real quick and maybe a little bit of the story of the disassociation, and then that's
I'd love to hear. I want to know the
ecclesiology question.
I want to know the inside. Yeah,
there's so much here, man. So the board at the time. So again, just to recap for those who were completely unfamiliar, the Vineyard Anaheim was the very first Vineyard church out of the entire global Vineyard movement. Or that's the flagship. Maybe I shouldn't say the first, but it was the flagship one. It was the one that John Wimber himself pastored at and headquartered at. And as a result, it was the one, right, that when they needed to buy the property, the whole global Vineyard family from all around the world, right, would visit. They'd come to the conferences. They would pin money. They would make offerings and donations to make sure that the Vineyard global movement could be headquartered and ran and represented by this one in Anaheim. So Alan Scott decided to serve notice to the head of the Vineyard USA, associate, like the network, that they would just no longer be a part, and that we were unilaterally making that decision. Now, what happened, right, is they alerted Vineyard USA, and then the very next day, word about Alan's decision began to spread because he had just told the leaders of the Vineyard USA, right? So they jumped the gun. As a member of staff, this is exactly what happened. I had a phone call. I was with my entire compassion ministry team. We were all at Disneyland actually that day, like a annual trip to hang out and bond. We get a call from Lambert Lowe, the compassion pastor, and he says, "Hey guys, I have a little bit of news for you. Unfortunately, I got to tell you right now on the phone because it's already began to leak." It's a terrible way to say that. It's began to leak. Maybe you would not know this, but we are a part of a association. We want to emphatically emphasize it is not a denomination. It's just an association that some of you probably aren't even aware of. But we're pulling out for 4 reasons. I want to get these reasons right. I hope this is right. I have it written down and text everything up. We have 4 reasons why we're disassociating. Because as long as we are part of the Vineyard Association, we cannot do what we feel God has called us to do in the area of missions, church planting, worship, and compassion. They're putting a lid or a cap on us, essentially is what they're saying. We can't spread out and do what we want to. And as a result, we are disassociating. We'll no longer be a part. Doesn't affect anything, but there's just going to be news about it. We want you to hear it from us first. So that was Lambert. He hung up. I know that another individual, coworker of mine, got the exact same call, exact same script from another manager, James Renwick. And then my wife got the exact same phone call, roughly the same script from Daniel Henderson, another pastor on staff. So we're like, okay, this is really crazy. I am reeling, by the way, inside. You know what I mean? I know what this means. I know a little bit more about the history and the heritage. I personally consider Bob and Penny Fulton, the original part of the original founding party and members, to be perhaps two of the loveliest people on the planet. And just thinking about what they're going through and what this means, I'm confused. The rest of the team doesn't really know, or maybe they do and they're keeping it in like me. You know what I mean? But I'm reeling. Me and Cynthia are freaking out over text. But of course, by Sunday morning comes around, Alan gives a speech to the church, which is the exact same speech he gave to the staff before, saying, hey, we made this decision. We probably made some missteps in the way that we communicated it, but there's no reason that we did this except that God told us.
Yeah.
And I'm confused. I'm like, wait, you gave us 4 reasons.
Yeah, I did get that audio, and I was just like, wow, this is... I actually imagine the meme you see of Michael Jackson eating popcorn. That was me. I'm like, this is going to be interesting. Oh my gosh. And it was a train wreck of a talk. Of a talk. Yeah. God.
I know I'm rambling here.
God told me, and we don't have, actually moving on to the next, when they finally announced it after the 2 weeks, the Lord shall name us. It was just like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. Yeah. If it wasn't our flagship, it would be purely entertaining, but also, because it just has a history for the movement. It was so, hurtful in those ways, but yeah.
So, yeah, wow. Anyway, so all that to say that next week, I went to Greg Shear, our HR, and I asked for a meeting with him, and I sat down and I said, like, hey, at this point, nobody knows who's on the board, Luke. You couldn't find it then. We didn't know now. I had a rough estimate of some of the characters because, like I was there on staff and I'd see them walk to like a board meeting. So I knew the day that like Banning sure showed up, but otherwise I knew it was Banning. I knew it was Alan. I literally don't think I knew anyone else. So I went to Greg Shear, HR, and I was like, hey, I have really deep concerns. So I was like, this is being underplayed significantly by Alan. Like the ramifications of this, what a big deal this is and how hurtful this can be. And I was like, and quite frankly, it feels disingenuous to tell everybody it's not a problem when I feel like, people's jobs might be at stake here on the staff, like the community might fall apart. We don't know about like the naming and like visa, you know what I mean? Like I was like, it feels really like you're overplaying it. Greg at that moment decided to tell me that he was on the board. And I had no idea that I was talking to him. He was like, yeah, he's like, I think we really made a mistake, with the way that this was done. He's like, to be completely honest with you, Brad, he's like, we had discussed the possibility of doing this, but we didn't know that Alan was going to make that decision. So at this point, what I feel like I understood is that he got sort of like acknowledgement or some degree of consent from all of the board members that he was going to make that decision. They just didn't know when he was going to do it, with the exception of being Pete Gregg and the entire board at that time.
I was going to say that was an important thing because Peter Gregg had clarified that he would, I think he even said that he would not have become a board member if he knew that was part of that's what he allegedly says now. I'm going to avoid giving my full opinion on Peter Gregg right now because I'm trying to be a Christian right now. So keep going.
Yeah. And it turns out that the board at that time consisted of Alan Scott, his wife, Catherine Scott, Jeremy Riddle, Jeremy's wife, Katie, Julian Adams, who's a pastor at a church in Boston now. Then there is Pete, who is the leader of the 24/7 prayer movement. And then there's Banning Liebscher, pastor of Jesus Culture in Sacramento, came out of Bethel. That time, again, since a lawsuit was brought by the previous board of Vineyard Anaheim saying that Alan essentially, again, not super adverse in the lawsuit and all the legalese, but essentially are saying that he had the intention of doing this the entire time and misled the initial board. Yeah, and misled the initial board. Since that lawsuit got brought forward, I think Katie Riddle, Catherine Scott, and Pete Gregg all jumped off like right away.
Julian as well.
Julian waited a little bit and made the most hilarious announcement on Facebook. You can like see a picture of his announcement. He like makes a quick Facebook. This is like global controversy. There's global news reports. Like, some of you may have heard I'm on board at Dwelling Place Anaheim. Due to my translocal ministry commitments, I just can't do this anymore. But love and blessings to them, which is just so dishonest, disingenuous, and it's just so silly. I laugh about it every time, but it's those small petty mistruths that just put together like the pattern and the figure of the type of people that Alan and his associates are. You know what I mean? It's just like, you just can't be straightforward. You can't be honest. You can't address things. Anyways, they dropped off. And ever since Jeremy left, it leaves no one except for Alan Scott, Greg Shear, the one who is afraid of him and on staff, and then Banning Liebscher. And so those are the three last remaining board members. Anyways, that was a long answer to a very short question of yours. So
Catherine is no longer a board member as far as you know.
Not as far as I know. Now, it's very possible they've added people or replaced people since.
But no one knows.
There's no way of knowing unless you're somehow privy to the internal workings or mechanisms. Again, that's just lack of transparency, lack of real accountability. Or, you would think like if you were a church with goodwill and good intentions that are having these types of issues, that you would make multiple points of communication and leadership open and clear about who to contact and how. I think
this actually brings up, more of this ecclesiological concerns is that I think it's fascinating. So if you are in a, I'm going to say NAR. Okay. And I know that there's some people, I got some pushback by Cindy Jacobs the other day, a little bit about using the NAR word because she doesn't feel it represents people. But I also said, hey, I haven't heard any of you NAR people actually hold Alan Scott or Jeremy Riddle accountable, so I have a hard time taking you actually seriously. And that's kind of a critique I've got about the NAR apostolic fivefold world, is that you guys all talk about the authority of apostles, but none of you seem to have the courage to actually call out what is a major problem. I mean, spiritual abuse alone. Let's just, because the leaving the vineyard part is actually not as problematic for me. I can see how people would decide to disfellowship, or I think that the way they did it was 100% wrong. I would have done it, if I were doing that, I would have done it way differently, but I can understand that. I think that that's potentially the fact that they left, I guess, is my point, is not the problem. It's the way they left. And I also think that the unethical practice of stealing all the assets and whatnot is really, really bad as well. What has been the most concerning to me is the spiritual abuse, and how there is so much toxicity around Alan Scott and Jeremy Riddle, their leadership. So going back to the ecclesiology observations and concerns, is that you can't have accountability when you have an apostolic prophet person, because they're with this unchastened sense of authority, and that's like in that case, the board, if you have a board member who's actually afraid of you, that's a problem. And so there's a problem with the lack of accountability. I have heard numerous statements by Alan Scott from the pulpit over the past 4 or 5 years that he really has no sense of family, doesn't care about people leaving. All the recordings that was put out on the Roy's report essentially is him saying things that are absolutely unbelievable. I mean, I could not imagine saying those things about just dismissing people and hoping they leave and not caring about caring for them. I mean, it's just absolutely terrible. So there's lack of accountability, no sense of a community. There's an anti-family vibe, I think, overall. I mean, because I think it's crazy that Carol Wimber still hasn't gotten a phone call back. Like, the founder of the Vineyard Church there can't have a meeting with him, and they always blame it on the lawsuit. I've seen and heard that, but it's interesting because they also accuse everybody for not following Matthew 18 and having a conversation with them, in regard to the spiritual abuse thing. So what are your thoughts about some of the ecclesiology, from an inside look?
Yeah. Oh God. Yeah, I think the ecclesiology, well, again, there's definitely nothing formalized, right? There's no such thing as like a true worked out theology or framework for how the congregation is supposed to relate to one another, to the pastoral staff, when the entire structure is set up in such a way that you're just supposed to be able to do whatever Alan wants. Like it's set up in such a way that he's supposed to be able to pull whatever levers, make whatever command he needs to make, and so that people will do what he wants to do. Now, as far as what it means for what the church and the relationships look like, from Alan's disposition, people are problems. People are messes that need to be put in line and brought into order. They need to be shaped, and the language that we would use to palletize this and to sanitize it is that these individuals, no one except for someone who has been proved, been put through the ringer and tested strenuously by Alan, or through someone else on staff, is that these people lack our culture, and they need to do whatever it takes to come into line so that their behavior and their actions and their posture reflects our culture, our values, and what we want them to act like. And what that means is,
just really quickly, it's just this connected to my mind. So he's on record as talking about body types, and there's certain body types out there that are not worthy of being in certain leadership roles, because they reflect values, culture, decision making, etc., while he simultaneously won't allow anybody to work on their body type to exercise. Is that?
Yeah, that's what we're putting it. Definitely. So
I mean, is that true?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, it largely is, and I could definitely like add some higher resolution to this. So,
this is
again,
insane.
so like when it comes, it is insane.
Cult. Keep going.
So these episodes. I was gonna say we need 100 episodes to probably talk about all this stuff. Okay, so let me get to spiritual abuse real quick, and then I'll tie in some of the ecclesiology stuff. Right. Yeah. So spiritual abuse, people have to ask like a definition. I'm not probably the expert to give it, but it's easy enough to think about it as psychological or emotional abuse in a religious context, using religion to as the instrument to cause these wounds and abuse. You know, the way that this is like inflicted dwelling places, because Alan has no regard for people except beyond their usefulness to him and his mission. And he didn't just, I'm not just saying that to slight him. I mean that this is ingrained in his theology and his thinking and the things that he teaches and practices, that people, he hated this concept of like the pastoral, and he didn't like community. And the reason that he doesn't like community, like small groups. They do it even though he hates it because it's obviously necessary. Because he doesn't think, he would oftentimes say that people get in the way of mission, and friendships and being relational begins to overtake the missional component of a church, and that Jesus needs to be centric and not other people. If you focus on other people, then you end up into people pleasing, doing what they want. We lose sight of Jesus and the beauty of Jesus, or being missional oriented and on an external quest. And what that does, right, is that going into your body type thing, the body type thing is awful. You know, it's interesting. He would use body typology called bioenergetics. I'm very familiar with it because it is an interesting concept. I've like read multiple books on it. I've like looked into this stuff. The problem is that it's completely non-academic, not backed by actual like research, like in any whatsoever. And number two, it is completely discriminatory in the world of, it doesn't account for anything having to do with race, with genetics. And that's what makes it not just bodyist, honestly, but just racist in a way. But what Alan did with this type of thing, you know, these types of frameworks, and this is what I mean in the sense that there's not a direct philosophy all the time about it. It's just Alan taking tools like these and projecting his prejudices on them. As he would say something like you hear famously in one of the audios, Noah Bolt's videos and some of the other things that are posted, is like, people with these types of body types that look like this, they value things that I don't want in my culture, so I will never hire them. So we have to toss them out. But he also did this other body types, the body type 2, which is like someone like, which he literally said to my face, 2020 February, right? It was like one of my body types. He would say, and he would often say in like leadership sessions and stuff like that, like, I can look at people and just by the way that they're postured and the position that they sit, I can tell if they're pastoral or not. And if these people are pastoral, then I know that if I put them in a place of leadership over a volunteer group or in staff, then anything that they are in charge of will shrink. It won't grow. It won't get more people into it because the pastoral anointing, pastoral role and position doesn't grow. It can only shrink because it's too people focused. And what that does, Luke, is it created a it's like not even an open secret, just this open acknowledgement among pastoral staff that you do not want to be seen as being pastoral. Like Alan was at me, he said, you should not be doing one-on-one coffees with people. At least you can do it at first because you need some people to stick around, but you hit a certain number of people, you back off because you're going to become too pastoral, you become too attached to the sheep, you're going to love them too much, and we don't want that. You're going to get in the way. You shouldn't be doing those types of things. And this in and of itself, this type of like idea isn't harmful. Like, but what it does is it produces a behavior. Like what I mean by that is like me hearing that doesn't like hurt my feelings. I'm abused by that. What it does is it creates a culture, Luke, where people are just instruments. They are just meant to be used. They walk in the door and you are being judged and analyzed on every element and facet of your being. Are you useful to us? Can you fall in line with the mission and the vision of this church? No regard your humanity as a person, your intrinsic value as a human being, the love of God that they have for you. And if you're not useful, we don't want you here. We want to push you out. And they made efforts. They, like we set up systems and processes, and I'm guilty of this. This is why we came out, because it's like I want to say sorry for these things. It's like we create systems that push people away, that made them feel less than. Like Alan is the king of not having conversations. He's the king of not being clear, not being kind. He would never sit down with you and tell you that he has a problem with you or it's the way that you're acting isn't correct. He doesn't know how. He's too cowardly. He's too ashamed of all of his own stuff and issues. So what you do is he designs systems and cultures to screen for this. Like at one point he tried to have my wife and other pastoral staff, they'd have these newcomer lunches, which I'm sure they still do all the time. But what he would do for a time is he'd have them sit afterwards in a meeting and they'd say, all right, number one, it was your job during these meetings to go out and meet as many people as possible. You needed to meet tons of people. And Alan, again, is watching you to see who you talk to, who you get. He's watching to make sure you're doing your job correctly. You're not supposed to get to know people. He's just to screen the room. And then he'd sit him in a room later and he'd say, all right, let's rate the people. What do you feel like, just literally supernatural discernment? What do you feel their leadership capacity is? Because we only want a church of leaders. And other types of metrics, including how attractive are they? How conventionally attractive are they? Because there's one individual, he hasn't stepped forward or been public, so I don't want to say his name or their name. Maybe it's a she. I'm not going to say their name. But he was directly told by Alan, hey, one of your gifts is that you're on the better looking side of things and you can gather people who are better looking. So you shouldn't be gathering people who aren't a certain level of attractiveness. And again, it's not like it hurts my feelings that I'm not attractive. It's just when people get pushed into this system, they go into this environment expecting to worship God, to be met with a community that's open and loving and caring and compassionate, like the actual Christian stuff, the Jesus stuff. And instead, what they're met with is this environment where they're being judged and criticized and gossiped about and spoken about. And even if they don't know it consciously, they can feel it, they are in an environment that is making them sick.
Yeah.
And maybe the people in the outskirts, don't recognize it, but the people get closer and closer and closer in. That's what happened to us. That's what happens to so many of the people who then Noah and the Debrianas and the Nates and Annas. It's we were sick and we didn't know why. It's because they're just being shoveled.
It's the toxicity. I mean, I think that's that's why it's so concerning, is because I think I've said numerous times that, the reason why I just have not been able to get off of this topic, it's like this is the last one, moving on. There's other things to talk about. Is I just keep meeting new victims over and over again. And there's this toxicity because Alan Scott is a cult leader. Dwelling Place Anaheim is a cult. And I think we're at a point now where it's this is no longer a suggestion. I think the evidence is clear. Just listen to the recordings. That's all it took for me. It was oh yeah, this is not good. This is actually evil, because I actually think it's demonic. I will go beyond that. I don't think this is a difference of opinion. There's a lot of people that I have different opinions on theological things, but I think that they're well-meaning. We have a different approach to scripture. I see nothing but demonic. There's a reason why the church is shrinking. There's a reason why they defend. There are people in Alan Scott's inner circle, I'm positive of that now, who are defending spiritual abuse. That is absolutely crazy. And then on top of that too, I think it's troubling, that it doesn't take very much for people to see that in Alan's leadership, his worldview, people are simply commodities to a greater end, and those commodities can be used and abused and discarded left and right without a care in the world. And so not only has he done that to people in the past who need to be cared and loved and counseled and walked with and all of that, but it's like he's doing that to new people as well. That's why I think I applaud everybody. He keeps going out there and standing in front of that place and holding signs and warning people. I'm like, you guys are doing the Lord's work for sure. So, but I really appreciate you, Bradley, talking about, complicity is not the right word, because I know that you were in tension in that moment because you were having internal struggle too, but just recognizing that it was damaging to people and wanting to do something about it. I mean, there's a lot of people who wouldn't. And so I just appreciate you keeping that going, you're to be commended in that regard. I got one more question for you though, in regards to ecclesiology. How do people, I mean, what does pastoral care look like at the dwelling place? Is that, I mean, let's just say I need some counseling, marriage is on the rocks, or experiencing some depression. I can't get rid of it. I've gone forward for prayer every Sunday. I haven't, experienced a freedom yet. What does that look like? Is there systems for that?
No, absolutely not. So Alan's on record on multiple occasions, right, saying, in his opinion, the New Testament model of the pastor, you don't ever see pastors doing those sorts of things, right? So say, when was the last time you look in Scripture and you see like pastors doing funerals? When's the last time that you saw them doing, wedding ceremonies? Like, that's not what you're supposed to be doing. You're supposed to be rebuking and exhorting and building people up and all that stuff. And now, mind you, I do want to like sort of caveat this, because my experience is that Alan actually is like very unoriginal. So he plagiarizes like so much of his stuff, and then just either adds new language to it or tweaks it just enough to kind of like make it very distorted and weird. But no, the pastoral is in his mind is not supposed to do that. Like, if he had his way, he would do out with the pastoral concept altogether. I read when I said earlier, like, people didn't want to be known as pastors. Like, I don't mean that in the Vineyard way, where they carried it over the Quakers and like the no hat honor type of rule, which is very much trying to flatten the structure. It's because Alan felt, and he gets this, he's again, this is kind of a bit of a Bethel import, right? And Danny Silk's whole like honor culture, right? Which is that we are not a church. In his mind, he would say this, right? We are an apostolic house. We are not supposed to be pastors that like are in the weeds with people and doing that sort of thing. We are supposed to be raising up leaders, releasing them to nations, and whatever, breaking down strongholds in the spiritual. Or
well, that's interesting because because again, a lot of the apostolic, like if I was gonna, because I do believe that there is apostolic, prophetic, evangelistic, pastoral, teaching ministries for sure. I just, I think that it seems like there's a big difference in the way we define those terms between myself and the NAR folks. And there's more, I think, more focus amongst the NAR crowd about authority and alignment and all that absolute nonsense versus function, where there seems to be more emphasis on function in the New Testament. But with the pastoral thing, this just goes to show why theology and theological reflection is so important, because we actually have some really good primary sources from the generation of pastoral church leadership people right after the apostles, and we see pastoral care happening in funerals and in fact rites, the whole idea of last rites, that it's almost like Catholics just made that up 20 years ago. So in Alan Scott, his theological framework is so problematic, because it just discounts church history unless it's convenient for his arguments, and so he's glad to quote from some obscure revivalist in the 1800s, but will totally discount the fact that we have really good resources from the 2nd and 3rd century about pastoral care and how important that is for the church. So I just want to point out that is another reason why I'm saying no, thank you.
Right. Well, a lot of these guys, of that sort of like attitude. I joked about this early on. Like, again, the funny thing is I joked about this early on with Alan to my wife. I say, sometimes I walk away from Alan and I feel like what he's saying is that um, everyone since like between us and the early church have done it wrong, but I'm going to be the first one to do it right.
Yeah.
Like that.
Yeah.
And that's like it's such a repeating attitude through so many of these guys. It's like, I'm going to return back to like the New Testament church. This is the way they really did it back then. And
Yeah.
everybody else, not just that has done it, but is doing it. Everyone else but me is doing this really wrong. And I have the real wisdom, the real truth, the real way. And remember, it's said much more sophisticated than that. It feels really pulls you in, right? Like these are Christians and they're good Bible-loving people. They want to do what the New Testament thing is. But then you look back, like you said, you hopefully, and I could use this, right? Like some education and some understanding. It's like, oh, that's not really true. And everything that's happened.
Yeah. Like what a low, I mean, again,
largely.
Going back to our, the whole idea of our theology of the Spirit, like, man, what a terribly low, thin approach to the Spirit, because it's like, yeah, the Holy Spirit was really active in the very beginning of the church and then went dormant for essentially 2,000 years. And then in these last days of 2000 and however long he's been pastoring, he's now showing up in power and restoring the church through Alan Scott's ministry. The thing that has in common, that restorationist theology is the same theology that that Mormonism and Jehovah's Witnesses and numerous cults actually appeal to. And so it's like, yeah, there's a very bad theological framework at work there. A very shallow, thin approach to understanding Scripture, doctrine of God. It's very, man. Okay, moving on. I digress. Oh, by the way, I don't know if I told you this. Actually, I don't think I did, but I on Easter Sunday, I met a couple that attended our church, and really, really nice couple. And they're like, "Oh, are you Luke Geraty?" When I was meeting people, I was doing pastor stuff, which is just so terrible, I'm hearing. But I was talking to new people I saw, and they're like, "Are you Luke Geraty?" And I was like, "Yeah." And they're like, "Oh, all of our friends have told us about you and that we were going to be in town. They said to come visit your church." And I was like, that's so weird. That never happens. So I was like, "Oh, who are your friends?" Like where? And like, "Oh, we legitimately, we go to the Dwelling Place." And I was like, I was working very hard for my face not to be like, like what? Because they were like, "Oh yeah, we've heard a lot about your podcast." And then I was like, all super like, somewhat like, "Oh my gosh, do these people, are they like investigating me? Am I being?" But it was very, very funny. But all that is to say is that it's interesting how these conversations that we have, there are people that I think are still stuck a bit. And I think, like you said earlier, a lot of them are well-meaning, and a lot of them just maybe haven't thought through some of these things because they're so inside, and they're so there's somewhat of an echo chamber oftentimes in our communities where we're not like considering the other perspectives. And that's what I'm hoping, that through these conversations, people will see how damaging and destructive because like, again, let's examine the fruit. The fruit that I see, they can spin. I know that they are great at spinning, but this church is shrinking. There's more and more victims coming forward. There's an independent investigation that they just brushed under the rug and said, "Oh, it wasn't actually independent," and that was all a hatchet job. But we've got numerous allegations from numerous people. The fruit is not there. There's not, the revival is not happening the way that Alan prophesied it would happen over the years, so hopefully people will consider those things.
Yeah. And on that too, I agree. It is an echo chamber. It's a very scarily isolated community and group. But in no small part by accident, like I said, that sort of just vilification of friendship and relationship, like you said, Alan has no friends. There's no one that he actually knows him or can be close to him or experiences him in any real way and can speak candidly or authentically to him. That's by design. And he encourages ultimately people to be that way, especially if you want to be close to him. I mean, again, part of like the manipulation and the abuse that he puts specifically people on his staff through, is like so many tests and control and manipulation. He yelled at my wife in a meeting just because she wants another pastor from another church invited her to a prayer meeting. And then she was like, oh, I should run this by Alan before I do it, which is not something you actually should have to do for the record.
Yeah.
But she was just running it by him. And he blew up at her and said, you broke trust. I can't believe that. And he would tell that to all sorts of staff. He says, if you're associated with people that I don't approve of, I shut off that door because they're a door to, you're a door, to whatever they have now. So I shut that door if you're associated with people I don't like. He told us not to be friends with certain people. Like he said that. He told Cynthia, it's like, I'm really concerned that you've been close to these two couples because now they have your ear. And ironically, right, they're the ones that eventually sat us down literally before they left the church. Like, we're really concerned about this church. We're really concerned about you and we should leave. So all that to say, the echo chamber is not by accident. That's by design.
Alan Scott, who is listening to this podcast, just right now was like, I was right. My prophetic insight into that couple, you should have listened to me. This would all have been fine if you had not had them as your friends. Jeez.
That's right.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Well, let's move on to, we're hour and 30 minutes in, man. This is awesome. Just being able to address some of these really important topics. But let's talk. We've talked a little bit about because I want to end with, we're talking. I love how I hope we're trying to really talk about this biblical, theological, practical triad of different concerns related to the fruit. I mean, that's really what we're talking: the fruit, the theology of Alan Scott's leadership. But you'd mentioned a little bit about Bethel's influence amongst Alan Scott. I remember back in 2018, 2019, there were definitely, because I'll say initially it was interesting in the Vineyard. A lot of people were very excited about this new thing happening. And, there was a lot of momentum would be one maybe word I would use to describe kind of this feeling. But I do remember someone mentioning to me, they're like, oh yeah, it just seems like that the Anaheim Vineyard has become Bethel South. That was said to me. And then I think I was always concerned because I've just never found Alan Scott at all persuasive biblically or theologically at all. But I think what really ticked me off was when they reinvented this story about how they came to this dying church and started feeding the poor. And it was marketed in a way where it was like Alan and Catherine literally were praying together and the Lord put it on their heart to start this feeding program, when I knew for a fact that Lance and Cheryl and the Anaheim Vineyard had been doing that since the days of like John Wimber. Like that was just what the church was known for, which is like brilliant marketing. But there's this connection to Bethel, and I've seen the honor culture stuff based off of Danny Silk's book Culture of Honor. There's this NAR, there's this apostolic Christianity emphasis in that world. What was it? I guess, what are your thoughts on that and that connection? And do you see a difference between Bethel's way of articulating it and also carrying it out versus what you experienced in Anaheim?
Oh, gotcha. Yeah, that's a good question. So, I mean, I want to do a couple of things. I want to be like honest enough, like just to say, like, I'm just not going to find me being an apologist for any of these guys. You're not going to find me be an apologist or justifying or commending anyone, Bethel or whatever, any of these guys, Jesus Image, all of that stuff. My advice is run away. But so as far as what it is, again, yeah, it's deeply, deeply related, and they steal from each other in terms of like ideas and concepts and things that are working. Alan, though, like I said, Alan, let me put a couple things in phrase. So Alan, again, like I said, plagiarized things clearly, and then just kind of like rework it, right? So like you'd retitle it. And I mean the Bible, dude. I remember one time going back just even like to some of that anti-pastoral stuff. I remember I sat next to him at a staff breakfast once. He was like, "Oh, what's going on? Like, what's the Lord doing in your life these days or something?" And I was like, "I've been reading like the pastoral epistles lately. I really like 1st and 2nd Timothy. I feel like I've been getting a lot out of it." And he's like, "Well, Brad, as you know, a lot of modern scholars have stopped calling it pastoral epistles and they're calling it the apostolic epistles now." Which is just so not true, Luke. But that's just part of his, his allergy to these things. But he does the same things that Bill Johnson's teachings to build all of them. But
that's awesome. So genius. I'm going to start doing that. A lot of scholars, one that I recently read, are.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, he didn't want to call them fivefold ministry. He called them ascension gift ministries. Like, he just needs to rebrand and relabel anything, including the church he stole. But so guys, I feel like I'm detracting from your question a little bit.
This is great. Yeah.
I mean, as far as similarities go, I mean, they're deeply similar, but not because Alan wants to be like Bethel. Alan wants to have what Bethel has and be known for it. That's one of the things that Daniel Henderson had told.
The supernatural stuff, correct?
No. Look, I mean, at the end of the day, I don't think, and you consider this ungenerous of me, but look, at the end of the day, I don't really think that these people care maybe once upon a time they cared that much about these things. They don't. They want reputation. They want fame. They want to maintain the lifestyle that they have. They like the recognition. They want to be able to maintain a facade that they're a superstar, in the religious world. I don't think that they're authentically wanting these things. I just don't. But I think he wants that. I think he wants to be known as a Bill Johnson. I think he wants to be adored in the eyes of the public like Bill Johnson is. And I'm not endorsing Bill Johnson in that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. All of those things. That was part of the reason that I remember Dan Henderson had told my wife about why Vineyard Anaheim, or Alan was taking the Vineyard out of the association, including the 4 things I listed. My wife said, Daniel also told me a couple more things. And one of them was, Alan is tired of having people come to the church wanting its history and what Wimber had and not wanting what Alan has. Like, he got so frustrated that every time a Rand Mark, Mike Bickle, or whoever got up, a Heidi Baker got up, they'd say, "We're so grateful for this house. We're so grateful for everything that this legacy is." It bugs him because a guy of his disposition, can't stand it not being about him, not being about what I built, not about what I'm doing, my culture, my DNA. It just irked him so much. And I recognize when we say
he fundamentally dislikes everything about Alan or about John Wimber, and that's obvious in his theology, his practices, his dismissals, his discounting of everything from the past. It's like he fundamentally. That's why I've been saying for a long time, he is not us in the Vineyard. Alan Scott has never been us. His Pentecostal theology and roots are fundamentally in opposition to every value that we learned from Wimber. So that's not surprising at all that he would be threatened by, this appreciation for the history. Whereas I think a healthy leader would be like, wow, I get to be a part of what of God's story here. They use that language a lot on their entering into God's story, and all that marketing lingo, but they fundamentally don't actually see it that way. It's like they can't see how they could actually honor the past and celebrate the future, and move forward and build on that. Which is so man, I just cannot believe that.
Yeah, that's right. At the end of the day, again, it's just honest attitude towards everyone. Like I said, whether you're the poor person looking for God coming into the church, or whether you're another mega Christian superstar who you pay lip service to. I don't know of a single guest that came to Vineyard Anaheim that Alan didn't talk trash on later in private. You know what I mean? Like, John Mark Comer would get up there, you know what I mean? And he would speak to the staff, you know what I mean? And then literally would shut off the laptop. And then Alan would be like, well, he's not very prophetic and never really is good at being prophetic. So let me bring the prophetic. It's the same reason these days that Alan can't get up and help himself, but get up at the end of every single sermon that he's present and do the ministry time. Because he can't stand not being the one in control, not being the one getting the credit, not being the one orchestrating something. And what that goes back to, to link it back to some of the Bethel stuff, it does go back to this, people again, the image of Alan and the very strong words that I'm using right now against him will probably shock like some of the people at the staff at the church, and they think like I'm just bad mouthing him. First thing I say is, I understand that's not your experience of Alan. It wasn't mine at first either. But if the duplicity and the two-facedness didn't exist, then I wouldn't be up here. I wouldn't be saying the stuff that I'm saying. Like, it would be necessary unless he was intentionally trying to deceive you. What I'm talking about is like real stuff that happened in very private rooms, for years at a time, validated by a lot of people. But part of this attitude, is that
you're bringing up. I was just going to say there's an interesting thing here that you're bringing up in relation to, because I have noticed that as well, is that every single time that there's ministry time or whatever you want to call it, we call it ministry time in the Vineyard. Alan is generally controlling that. There's a lot of that, but it's interesting. I was reading. There's this absolutely excellent paper. Or actually, it was just a letter, essentially, or article by John Wimber, which I had mentioned to you, on the fivefold ministry. And at the very end of it, where he basically provides a really healthy, critical engagement with some of the frameworks and the assumptions that people hold from that world, from the ascension gift advocates, as you said. But he mentions this when he talks about in his conclusion. He says that if fruit that will last, from John 15:16, and equipped to serve, from Ephesians 4:12, are the goals. Okay, so assuming that you're taking the biblical, summary of the purpose of these functions stands. He says there should be some suggested questions to ask for each of the five functions. For apostolic function, he says, how many disciples and churches are there as a fruit of your ministry? Prophetic function, he says, do the prophetic words benefit others? How many believers are equipped to prophesy? Evangelistic function, how many have been won and brought into the life of the church? How many evangelists have been trained and released? Pastoral function, how many people have been equipped for life and ministry? How many are able to help others in the same way? Teaching function, how biblically accurate, personally helpful, and culturally current is the teaching? How many teachers have you been equipped and released? So Wimber had this emphasis on, like, it's not about us being the star, right? Because he held to a pneumatology that was, he summarized it by saying everybody gets to play, right? Like, everybody gets to participate, and we're supposed to, like you acknowledged earlier, flatten out. There's no superstar Christians, but yet in the Alan Scott Apostolic Fivefold, NAR, Ascension Gift, Bethel Supernatural Ministry world, it seems like there's a lot of superstars. There are a lot of superstars, right. And that, I think, is a major problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Dwelling Place is really great at doing like this sleight of hand where like, we're not about celebrity, and then like only hire celebrities for a while, and and like to do work. Yeah. I'm going to put Matt Redman and Jeremy Riddle and Catherine Scott and all these people, and there is that culture, and Noah can probably talk to some of that better than me. But yeah, no, you're absolutely right. That hierarchy is super strong, and a lot of people, it's like, well, I've never heard Alan call himself an apostle. A, he does, and put it back, but B, the other thing, going straight back to Danny Silk, what he loved to call himself, because he always needs to relabel, is he loved to call himself like the chief architect, which is stealing from in the Bible when Paul says in Corinthians, right? Like, I did this as a master builder. It's like the Greek word for architect. And so Alan literally runs around calling himself to people, I'm like the chief apostle, I'm the chief architect. You know what I mean? And the idea behind that, like you said, is that in this hierarchy with the fivefold is that churches are fundamentally incapable of reaching divine destiny or God's purpose for them. Churches are incapable of stepping into that unless there is an apostle at the helm that they follow. And that churches aren't at all autonomous or individual to do things as a community. They have to be following one man's vision. And it is nuts and it is crazy. And what I was going to say about it, go on.
Well, I was just going to say, so you're talking a bit about this book, kind of a theological reflection. So Danny Silk, because I think it's when I first heard about this book, because I want to have you share some thoughts on this. When I first heard this book, I was like, oh, culture of honor. I mean, yeah, honor is cool. We should be more honoring to people, and that sounds good. And I kept hearing about it from all these people, and it was usually people would say it like, the way we talk about people just is so dishonoring. And it was like, oh, okay. Yeah, I think that's probably true. And then I noticed that there was like slowly a shift where it was like the way that we speak about leaders needs to be honoring. And it was starting to sound a lot like this old, don't touch the Lord's anointed, theology, where it was like, don't speak up about spiritual leaders. Actually, literally, we just heard this with this Mark Driscoll, pole dancer thing that was all over the internet, where the pastor
Mark Driscoll did a pole dance. What?
No, yeah, I did not say that. But the pastor of that men's conference, I watched him when he sat down with Mark. He went in on this big, long, don't speak against people in authority. It was literally word for word exactly what we're talking about here, which is don't touch the hand of the Lord's anointed. If you speak up against leaders, you are going to be outside the will of God, and you won't have the blessing of God. So I started hearing things like that from people who were influenced by culture of honor. And so I was like, I got to read this book. So I bought this book and read it, and it is it's interesting because what it actually is an ecclesiology. It is a church government book, and I think a lot of people don't actually catch that. There's a sleight of hand in the way that it was written too. But essentially, Silk is arguing for churches to be able to, it says it literally on the front, sustain a supernatural environment in order to see miracles of prophecy, healings, all that. You have to actually align yourself in a fivefold NAR apostolic top, work your way down manner. And so it is actually an argument for ecclesiology. And the suggestion is for revival and renewal and supernatural stuff to happen. You have to find an apostle and align yourself with them. So it's I want to just say, read John Wimber's article. I have it linked in the description. It will be so helpful to understand why there's a lot of us charismatics who are like, nah, bro, we're good. We're not going to go down that road. It's just a train wreck. Can you help me? Let's talk about some of the practical concerns about that theology. Like, what are some of the things that you personally experienced that you can say are detrimental to the life of the church?
Yeah, well, I would say the so much. I think the first thing, though, right, is that it fundamentally undermines the equality of believers. I mean, like in the most direct way, there is no way that you can read that book or listen to it and walk away with an impression that all believers, that all just people in general are fully valuable in the eyes of God and are capable of fulfilling their, like, being fully realized human beings, unless they're somehow like connected to this apostle or prophet. Like, that is what it's fundamentally meant to do. And it's meant to put you, honestly, and like, I know I went and reviewed it like kind of recently, like when we, like you told me we're going to be doing this chat, and
we got to re-say that. You broke up a little bit there for that last sentence. There was something really good.
Sorry.
I was sensing it.
No, I went and reviewed this book because he said it, and what makes me sick, man, is that it's really just teaching a whole spirit of just absolute, utter submissiveness to leadership. It is you to be doing what they say, to be in alignment with them. Because if you are not in alignment with these leaders, these self-appointed apostolic leaders, then you are outside of God's will. And that is, like you said, to go back to the cult thing, recognizing that cults is on a spectrum. It's not everything is Heaven's Gate. You know what I mean? It's like, it's a spectrum. But like, the fundamental element of this is like, there are leaders that have special wisdom and revelation from God, and they are arbitrarily in charge of eternal punishment or eternal rewards. Mm-hmm. That is harmful. It is toxic. And that's what that whole book teaches, is that you need to be aligned underneath the prophet, aligned underneath the apostle. You do what they say. And the whole honor thing about not being able to speak against them, it fundamentally undercuts any semblance of truth and truthfulness of speaking honestly. I mean, scripture, what does it say? It says, so speak and so do as the one who will be judged by the law of liberty. What does that mean? It's like, you can say, you do. Yeah, go on.
Well, I was just going to say, you also have, you have plenty of examples where apostles would confront teachers, each other, Peter, Paul. But one thing that I think is, especially in an age where abuse is now becoming so rampant, is that this, I always like to think about, like, I try to do this about every theological conviction or perspective. What I always try to do is, like, okay, like, I know I might have the ability, or maybe someone else has the ability to, like, see the tension in it, and maybe I don't articulate as clearly as I want to, but I kind of, like, I know that there's a limit to this, or so I think about the downstream consequences of ideas. Like, let's just remove this idea down the river a little bit, and kind of, where does it end up as? I mean, there's no other way to say it other than, in a culture of honor ecclesiological system, you are going to protect abusers and rapists and sexual molesters because you are wanting to not speak up against the Lord's anointed, and anything like that would be. Yeah. So I think Silk, and I'm not saying Silk would ever say that. I have seen recently Bethel finally took a stand after a lot of pressure, though, for somebody who was a predator amongst their community, and they did take the stand. So I want to acknowledge that. But I just, this theology, though, is definitely there, right? And that's why I think a lot of us have a lot of concerns about the influence of its ideas. Is that because if you do have a leader that is an Alan Scott, who is abusing people are hesitant to get out of alignment with the supernatural superstar and address these significant concerns that have been validated by numerous victims. And so that's why I think it's absolutely it's a train wreck, honestly.
Now, look, you in order to walk, like, you need to do theological gymnastics. You need bad religion in order to convince people that just simply speaking the truth is somehow wrong.
Yeah.
Speaking the truth is never wrong. It's never a bad idea. I'm a big Simone Weil fan. You know what I mean? She probably represents me, or I try to, ascend to her level, more than anyone, like, these days. And I love, she once said, like, like, God actually prefers when we prefer the truth over him, because Christ was truth before he was Jesus. And anyone who departs from him in the pursuit of truth, it'll not be long before they end up falling into his arms. And it's like, it's like, you're in these issues, you're in these situations and these cultures. It's like, you should never be afraid of speaking truth, of speaking reality, saying what's going on. Oh, what if I say something wrong? What if I misstep? That's what the grace is for. That is what the grace is for. And if you're afraid of that, if you're afraid that I'm going to misspeak something, I'm just going to break someone, I'm going to be rejected, I'm going to be harmed, it's like, well, then you're not in a community of grace. You're not in a real, actual Christian community of convivial relationships and friendships and what Illich, right, would call networks of living concern. Mm-hmm. It's absolutely mind-boggling that anyone, including myself, right, would be convinced it's like that speaking the truth is somehow anti-Christian, anti-God. And that's
but
again, go on.
That is the evidence of, I mean, I want to just say that's, I've been really trying to, because it's been tough at times where I'm like, how do people not see this? You ever find yourself saying that? And it's like, at least I do. And I'm like, oh man, I just do not, this is so obvious, but then at the same time too, I think, it's not just the echo chambers, but there's just a lot of dynamics where it's funny, because I've spent a fair amount of time down in Yorba Linda over the years, and you and I have a lot of mutual friends down there, and I'm always, like, very fascinated about the dynamics about how interconnected all these relationships we're talking about are. I'm like, so and so's daughter is married to so and so's son. They're on the different ends of the spectrum, and they attend there, and I'm like, wow, this is so crazy. So it does get a little, it can be a bit complicated, I guess, or complex in discerning some of that too. Relationally, it's like, knowing when, but it does seem, though, when your framework, though, because there's a pattern of, I would say, preemptive abuse, where there's a pattern of, like, slowly brainwashing people to get to the point where you can start asking them to deny reality. That doesn't happen overnight, I guess, is my point. It's
right. Well, yeah. And the thing about the honor culture thing specifically, because that was spread throughout Dwelling Place, like, really hardly, is that the sleight of hand here with this, not to keep reusing that term, is not that it straightforwardly says always like you should not focus or say anything, or shouldn't say anything bad. It's that you need to focus on the good.
Yeah.
Right. So the way that Alan taught about this, and I actually also discussed with him before we left, my problem with it is he preached several times messages. I would basically get up and say, this is what honor is. Honor is, like 100%, person. 80% of it is critical and bad that you have to say. And then there's 20% good. Honor is choosing to say the 20% good.
Mm-hmm.
And what that does is twofold, right? It's exactly this. It reinforces for us, because it sounds really good, like on its front. It sounds like it's like this idea of like, well, yeah, I'm not going to complain. I'm going to see the best in people. I'm going to believe, love believes all things.
Yeah, it sounds great.
But not at the cost of truth. But what it does is it validates two things, right? It's like, one, it gets me to feel like anytime that I have an issue with someone, rather than actually confronting and having a legitimate, transparent conversation with this understanding that there's going to be listening and back and forth and room for expression. It means I'm bad thinking that I shouldn't be thinking. I just need to talk about the good, call out the good, and eventually they'll get in line. And that extends especially, of course, to my leaders. And when I told Alan about it, I told him this after the disassociation, something I met with him, and we talked about a slew of issues that we had and got nowhere with it, got gaslit the whole time, to use the popular culture term. I said, like, I feel like these 80-20s, I was like, there's a lot of truth that gets swept into that 80% of things that we're not saying. And I told him, I was like, I feel like constantly, like here at the organization, like there's always something happening in another room that I don't know about. And I remember his response is like, well, Brad, you'll never know everything at any organization that you go to. So I can't help you there. And that's just like typical throwing out. But again,
you're talking about conflict. Well, it's interesting to me too, just so going back to biblical theology here, Acts chapter 6, the first church split essentially, or conflict in the church happens like very quickly after the outpouring of the Spirit in Acts chapter 6, where the Hebrew Jewish people who are culturally very Jewish and then the Greek speaking Jews have a conflict because some of them are being taken care of and some of them aren't, right? And so then they pray and for the Holy Spirit to give them wisdom and to select people to, so it's a great text about how in the midst of conflict, the Holy Spirit can be at work. And because I thought that was interesting when I read this book, Culture of Honor, he has a whole thing about conflict. As you can see, the culture of honor both facilitates a safe place and in turn creates a place of great conflict. And it was like when I first read it, because I've read it twice now, maybe 2.5 times. I just remember I was like, man, the potential for this to be really helpful and good is there. But then it's built upon a completely faulty ecclesiological framework. And then it never takes things to its logical end, And again, I think you and I are both saying this should not be a formational book in our churches because it's a train wreck. All right, well, man, practical concerns. We've said so many. Spiritual abuse is evil. We've said that. I've multiple times said I think that Alan Scott and Jeremy Riddle and churches that are like this are atheist producers, because that's what I'm seeing. I think that there's a cheapening of the kingdom, a cheapening of the Spirit. I don't like how there's a preying upon people as commodities, which it's just so bad. Yeah. What can we say, like going from here? What would you like to see happen? Best case scenario, like maybe think about this from different perspectives. Okay. So for what would you like to see happen in the situation? What would you like to see happen for individuals? And then maybe like, what can somebody who's listening right now start doing? Cause I feel like it's like, oh, I'm praying. Okay. Is there anything else we can do besides praying? Cause I've been praying. I think, other people have been praying. What's some advice you've got for us to talk about, like putting this stuff into action or, putting our faith into action?
Yeah. That's a rough question. I think, So, like if I could maybe just speak to some of the people groups in that, I think I would say to kind of the people on the outside that are looking, is again, I'll keep going back to this. I think the bread and butter of Christianity is just being a good neighbor. It's convivial love and relationship, authentic, getting to know people, suffering with people, bearing each other's burdens, and not considering your interests greater than others, but considering others' interests greater than your own. What I mean by that is just start being just real people. Get to know each other, be friends, be friendly, ask people if they're okay. If you know individuals who are going into these types of churches that are starting to act funky when they're in these religious organizations, if you see something, say something. Start asking questions, start being close. I think on the outside, I would start saying it's really important that we don't continue to perpetuate and platform. It's not about getting people to talk, openly. Any type of celebrity pastor, mega church leaders on the circuit that are going places. So if you have people that go into your church or, coming as guests, being invited, be vocal, talk to your pastor about it, talk to other people. If you happen to go online and Twitter instead and you see some feedback, go jump and support and listen to the people who have some stories to share. I think speaking more directly to the relationship, I think there's still the need, all that we're after, we're not after canceling people, and I'm not a spokesperson for everyone, but I'm not after canceling people. I just want people to be held accountable. I think that there should be legitimate investigations done into the very concrete dozens and dozens and dozens of cases of spiritual abuse that have been leveled against Geraty, Alan Scott, and that entire company. These have been credible claims. I think there needs to be an investigation. I think beyond an investigation, though, my greater emphasis is that the people who openly associate with these people should be calling for a version of accountability, that they are public figures, the Banning Liebschers, the Pete Greggs, the Julian Adams, the John Mark Comer, John Tysons, all these guys. People who've associated, you need to start calling for accountability, start standing for it. Put your own neck on the line, put your own skin in the game, show yourself to be a responsible leader with conviction and courage, and not just take rewards and money and finances and fame and networks from them when it's convenient, but uphold your Christian duty to be a person of integrity now also as well. Anyways, man, I feel like I'm going to ramble on forever. I think I'd speak to the people at Dwelling Place themselves. I think I could speak to the staff with a degree of emotional. I was just there 2 years ago, or a little bit before. So I know so many people there. I love you guys and cared about them, and still do in a lot of ways. And I just don't think it's ever the wrong time to do the right thing. There's no reason for me and these other people to come forward and lie. I don't have anything to gain. I'd much rather not sit on a podcast, as much as I enjoy it with you, Luke, and talk about my mistakes and my shame and my lack of ability to be courageous and to represent myself well, to protect my life. It's hard for me. But I'm only doing it because my conscience won't let me do anything else. This is a really bad guy, and a lot of, and he's really hurting a lot of people, is wrecking a lot of people's lives. There's a lot of people in a lot worse situations than me. I'm very fortunate to say that, but it's bad. It's worse than you think. He's worse than you think, and he needs to be held accountable. He has no reason to be leading individuals. And I think that you could do something about it. It's never the wrong time to do the right thing. There's still a place that you can leave. There's still people who will accept you, who will love you, who will take you in. You have this place to land. You always do. People at the church, stop supporting. Doesn't matter if you're benefiting. It doesn't matter. The ends do not justify the means in the kingdom of God. It does not matter if you feel like the presence of God is so great, you think there's movement. It does not justify the abuse, the lack of character, the basic violations of love and kindness that are happening every single day. And if you know people who are in that community, I think you need to have talks with them. I think you need to encourage them to leave. I think there needs to be pressure. As I kind of address some of these leaders in a way. At the end of the day, I don't really believe in speaking truth to power. I just want to have people speak and speak to them. The fact of the matter is that we need to stop this version of Christianity and kingdom life that's so focused on leaders and celebrities and people that are just happen to be more popular than us to take our cues. That's just not where the power of God is. It's not the life and spirit is. It never will be. I think we just need to back off. We need to stop paying attention to these people and giving them things that they don't deserve. Only Jesus and that only other people do. So I don't know. I might have rambled there a bit, Luke. I don't know if that made any sense.
Very much so. I really appreciate your heart behind that. I think, something to, you mentioned the necessity of an independent third-party investigation. And I want to go on record as saying, I think that is that has to happen. And I think that at this point in time, Peter Gregg, who I know is no longer on the board, but has not publicly come forward. I hope Matt Redman, who I have to imagine has some thoughts on this, banning from Jesus Culture. There's a whole host of people that need to be also, I think, asked as to why they have not put some pressure on that and moved forward with seeing that happen, because there are just too many victims now. If it was one or two, I can totally be like, okay, yeah, there might be a conspiracy theory, but we have there are literally dozens of people, and you know many of them. So I want to see that happen. But one thing I could say, I want to say this about people who I was thinking about that. Two groups of people, because I've had conversations with a lot of victims, and my heart is just like so broken. It's like, I just feel like it's just so discouraging, because I have a hard time. I pretty much got to the point where I was telling my wife recently, where it's like when I meet a pastor, in my back of my mind, I'm like, I wonder if they're abusing anybody or they're having an affair or they're stealing money, because it's just so often it's like, but there's a lot of great pastors out there. I actually think that the majority of pastors out there probably are trying to love people and serve well, but there's just so much of a myopic focus on the loud personality cult that we've got going on. But I want to say, if you've suffered from spiritual abuse, it would be highly advantageous to yourself to see a therapist and talk to somebody who specializes in trauma and grief counseling, because I don't even think you can fully come to terms with the implications and how entangled your entire life can actually be. And it takes a while, and it's good to have some resources to help you process through that. There's also some great books that I'm going to have in the description that can help you, maybe kind of find your way out of it a bit too. But I think that the church needs to be more victim-centered and less personality centered. And that's the one thing that's been really discouraging about this, is that a lot of these people that are perpetuating the narrative and the story coming from the abuse seem to be so opposed to standing with victims. And that's really discouraging. So I'm hoping and praying that there can be some resolution. I cannot imagine that Alan Scott is going to remain in the situation he's in right now. It's not working. Narcissists want numbers and they want crowds, and he doesn't have it. And it seems like the fruit of his ministry is found wanting. So I'm hoping and praying that this does come to an end sooner than later. Hopefully.
Yeah. No, it's just a matter of time. And the rumor on the street is he's going to try and take a sabbatical or hand off the church to someone. And who knows if there's truth to that. But like you said, the fact of the matter is it's unsustainable for him. And I do agree with you. Look, like I said, I'm far from being an apologist for pastors and people in ministry, quite frankly, Luke. I've been frank with you about that before, so you know that. Yeah. But
I do know.
But at the end of the day,
I do know.
Yes. But yes, like you said, there's, for individuals who have gone through experience through things like my wife has, and through some people like I know, there is healing and there is resolution and there is growth from it. Like you said, the therapy is a great chance. Don't ever be in a rush, at least for us is how it worked. Don't be in a rush to jump back into some sort of faith community. There's going to be a ton of landmines, and that's okay. Really, again, the most healing thing for us at this point has been, like you said, is therapy, is conversation around people who are going to love us and listen to us, resonate, believe us, that make you feel like crazy, and that just gather around other people who've experienced the same thing as you, and just help bring some stability to that craziness. And then eventually, hopefully learn to laugh at it. making jokes and poking fun at how insane this stuff has been and this craziness that these people say, absurdity of the life that they're living. You know, you reclaim a little bit of your agency and your power in that. And again, that comes naturally, but there is hope. There is healing. There's good stuff that can happen in the future. Take it in stride at your own time. And in the meantime, Luke is going to hunt in every bad actor and take him down, because that's what he's going to say.
Right. That's not true. Well, hey, it's been really great talking with you, Bradley. I appreciate you taking the time to do this. And for everybody listening, if you want to help share this, I'd be appreciative. We would appreciate that. If you want to leave comments, you can feel free to do that. If you leave a comment that's ridiculous or anonymous, I probably won't respond to it because no, thank you. And then just thanks for listening. So